Right now, we're right where we just left you before we went to the weekend. This insane shutdown, it continues as we report tonight, and there's no end in sight. We're going to try and figure out how this thing ends here, and believe it or not, could the people at the root of this, the Tea Party, come out of this stronger, or will they be weaker than ever? And next, Huntington's disease, a debilitating illness that leaves its victims without the ability to speak, eat, or walk. Well, tonight, we'll hear from how this deadly disease impacts not just its victims, but the entire family. And later, is A-Rod's suspension unfair? You heard me right. We're going to hear from the man orchestrating efforts to lighten his punishment. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this Monday evening, October 7th. Now, for many of us, the weekend, it's a chance here to catch our breaths here and try and take a little bit of a break from what are the rigors of the week. Well, if all goes well, that annoying guy you work with won't enter your mind. Guess that wasn't the kind of weekend it was when it comes to members of Congress. No progress, zippo, when it comes to the shutdown. The government still closed, and now many of us still hoping it doesn't get worse, and oh yes, it can get worse. And let's start with the very latest on Capitol Hill, and for that we bring in our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman. And there's two competing clocks here we're dealing with, the ongoing shutdown, but also the looming debt limit.
And there are two bits of good news to report tonight, Rich. Unfortunately, they're both on the debt limit and not on the shutdown. First, unnamed White House officials saying the president would sign off on a short-term deal on the debt limit if it came to him clean, that is, with no spending cuts or links to Obamacare. And secondly, Senate Democrats plan to introduce a bill this week to raise the limit for a longer term. If passed, Congress would only be able to block it with majorities in both houses. But again, all of that is on the debt limit. As for the government shutdown, now in its 7th day, no progress, and it is still all about the blame game.
On day 7 of the government shutdown, finger-pointing. President Obama said House Speaker John Boehner could get the government back up and running.
There are enough Republican and Democratic votes in the House of Representatives right now to end the shutdown immediately, with no partisan strings attached. The House should hold that vote today.
Not so fast, Speaker Boehner said yesterday.
There are not the votes in the House to pass a clean CR.
By ABC's estimate, there are at least 21 House Republicans who would join House Democrats to support a clean spending bill that gets the government back up and running and doesn't include changes to Obamacare.
The reason that Speaker Boehner hasn't called a vote on it is because he doesn't apparently want to see the government shutdown end at the moment, unless he's able to extract concessions that don't have anything to do with the budget.
And now the new message from Republicans: let's talk.
The American people expect in Washington, when we have a crisis like this, that the leaders will sit down and have a conversation. And I told my members the other day, there may be a back room somewhere, but there's nobody in it. We're interested in having a conversation about how we open the government and how we begin to pay our bills. But it begins with a simple conversation.
The next fiscal crisis is quickly approaching. The Treasury Department says that on October 17th, the government will hit its borrowing limit unless Congress votes to raise the debt ceiling. The Obama administration says if the government can't keep borrowing money, there could be catastrophic consequences in the global financial markets. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits could be put on hold.
Raise the debt ceiling next week so the Treasury can pay the bills that Congress has already spent.
John Boehner, far from the only Republican talking this weekend. Long Island's Peter King once again bucking his party and admitting that contrary to all the GOP talking points, this was Republicans doing the shutting down.
Because we are the ones who did shut the government down. Charles Krauthammer called it the suicide caucus. I mean, Wall Street Journal said they were kamikazes. You don't take the dramatic step of shutting down the government unless you have a real strategy and it has a chance of working. It's never had a chance of working.
And finally, the Daily Beast doing some reporting with some insight as to why the GOP did this. And they quote the chairman of the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, the guy whose other job is to get more Republicans elected to Congress. That's Oregon Congressman Greg Walden. The Beast reporting Walden told GOP donors at a swanky luncheon in Manhattan late last month, quote, "Listen, we have to do this because of the Tea Party. If we don't, these guys, those Tea Party guys, are going, or other Republicans rather, are going to get primaried, and they're going to lose their primary." It's a sentiment echoed by an in-depth report that we saw in the New York Times this weekend, Rich.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. Thanks, Andrew. I want to bring in Dominic Carter, of course, as well here. And we had hoped to have a Republican representation on the set today. It was just a scheduling conflict. But there's a mistake that always happens in the press. We've all done it here. We've all seen it done a lot of times. That when there's a problem, especially in Washington, and it's a complicated issue, we tend to say, well, they, meaning with this big Washington, they need to work together and figure this thing out. Sometimes it's not that complicated. Sometimes one side does it to the other. Let's be clear. Not one Democrat called for a shutdown of government. Not one Democrat is using the debt limit here as basically the hostage in an extortion plan. This is coming from one side. Now, believe me, Democrats have their faults, and I've taken them to task for a bunch of things on this. And there are things that probably we should reduce spending on and maybe look at tax policy or whatever. But nobody with a right mind, not one single economist that you can give any credibility to, and we'll get into other stuff, what happens on the 17th if we keep screwing around. This has been a man-made disaster. It hasn't made America safer. It hasn't made it stronger. And as you touched on, let's get into it a little bit, Andrew. Who's got their fingerprints on this? Because it hasn't been the Boehners of the world or the McConnells or the leadership. This baby came out of guys in the back room after Republicans got it handed to them after the last election in 12, and they said, how do we do this? What leverage do we have?
Well, you talked about the fingerprints on this, and we've done a lot of reporting since the shutdown threat really started to happen about Republicans who have defected, like Peter King, and said, this was our fault. We're the ones who did this. There are about 20 some odd Republicans we've heard that from who are sitting members of the House. But that Times piece that I referenced over the weekend takes it back to, you know, Charles and David Koch, the Koch brothers, and Ed Meese, the
and for people who remember, the Koch brothers are the billionaires guys who really took advantage of Citizens United here. They've poured millions upon millions of dollars. They've really helped prop up the Tea Party to really push business interests in local races here, and they've made litmus tests that if you don't get on board with what they want, and literally they give the blank documents and say sign at the bottom, this is what you're going to do, you're going to get your you-know-what primer. And they organized a concerted effort to pressure Republican lawmakers during this summer to get on board to this defund Obamacare or shut the government down strategy. We've put a lot of the blame, and so has the rest of the media, on Ted Cruz, who was the sort of centerpiece, the mouthpiece for that bus tour that went around the country. But you had a lot of Republicans in Congress saying, boy, I went home to town hall meetings, and I had people saying, you got to shut down the government unless they defund Obamacare. The people who were there doing that were funded by these groups, these conservative groups who wanted to put pressure on Republicans. Or they had tinfoil hats on and swear they talked to aliens at night. Okay, Dominic, here's my thing. We've done enough of these in different times, whether they're local, statewide, or federal things, to know even if there's hard negotiations and threats, at the end of the day, there's a strategy. It could be a union fight and whatever else. Just think about this. First, what did they want in the beginning? They wanted to defund Obamacare, right? No president in his right mind is going to take his one signature issue, and they knew that. Then it became, okay, let's delay it, okay? Let's do another year here before we delay it. That didn't work. Then they said, okay, we got a laundry list of things, like let's put the pipeline and all these other things that had nothing to do with the conversation. That didn't take well either. Then they said, okay, well, let's just negotiate. And their exact quote, well, one of them was, we don't know what we want, but we want to negotiate. I'm not making this up. Now, finally, it's, he won't talk to us. There's an incoherent message. And if you want to win an argument, you got to at least know what you want at the end of the day. They don't know what it is. I can't figure this out. This is the dumbest thing. And we've seen a lot of dumb things. This is the dumbest thing I can remember. And we're going to talk about it a little bit. This stuff can go from stupid to dangerous pretty soon.
Very soon. Very soon. I'm glad you used the term self-inflicted earlier. There's no other way to describe this. It's like the Republican Party took a shotgun, pulled the trigger, and then tried to pull the bullet back, and then tried to say, it's not our fault. It's outright ridiculous, yep. Richard. There's no other way to explain this. The only thing I disagree with what the premise that you two made is on this point. In many of these districts where these members of Congress, the far-right folks, the Tea Party folks, in which they've won their elections by 20 points or more, they're entrenched. The only battle they have is from the right. There are people that their strategy is to shut down government by any means necessary.
We're going to get into this in a little bit. There are people today. Now, the most dangerous thing is, just remember these dates here, October 17th, okay? That's the debt limit. When we come back after break, we're going to tell you what that means, okay? But suffice to say, it's really bad. It's really bad if you own a stock. It's really bad if someone you love gets Social Security. It's really bad if anyone you know has Medicare. It's really bad here if you want the economy to be good, or if you don't want the stock market to all of a sudden go into the toilet, okay? It's a bad thing across the board if people don't believe America will pay its bills. Bills it's already spent, obviously. And Andrew, before we get to that, though, we saw Peter King. And I give credit to the Long Island Republican who said, this is nuts. As it stands right now, if they just had the guts, and I think this is a good strategy for them, believe it or not, at this point, just have a clean vote. Have the minimum Republicans that don't worry about getting primaried vote that way, and 99% of the Democrats will vote the other way. They'll get the thing through. But as we know right now, there are fights going on with Republican against Republican saying, how does this end? What are you doing?
You heard in the piece that I put together that they think ABC thinks there's about 21 Republicans who would vote for a clean bill.
And they only need 17 if all the Democrats vote the other way.
And what I mean by a clean bill, what we mean by a clean bill is a bill that doesn't involve defunding Obamacare or put any other policy item onto reopening the government. So you only need 17 to get it through. There would be about 20 if they actually had the vote. And I think Peter King said if you had that vote in private, if you had a closed ballot vote, you might get 100 Republicans who sign on for this. There's a lot of people who know that this is not a great move for the Republican Party, but there's so much pressure, as we heard, to help keep the majority in the House.
I agree 100% with Andrew said, but I'm going to take it one step further. 100% of people, if they have any common sense, know this is a bad thing for America, okay? You can't have the minority dictate the majority policy. And you can't have, and there was an analogy today, Christoph wrote it, which was, do you imagine if the president said, if I don't get gun control, I'm going to destroy basically one of our aircraft carriers every single week. Now, we'd probably begin impeachment proceedings because it would be dangerous. But you can't negotiate with extortion and blackmail. And you can't run a company, let alone a government, that way, let alone the only superpower left in the world. I'm telling you, listen, we like debate at this thing, but this is so crazy and getting to be so dangerous here that somebody has to say this isn't just Washington. This is a band of 40 or 50 lunatics that are getting permitted by their bosses above them to do this. And I fault most of all the leadership to be tolerant of the crazies. Now, when we come back, we're talking about the other big part of this conversation, which is the debt limit. Trust me, we're now, what are we, only less than 2 weeks away here, 10 days before this thing will kick in. Now, we want you to join our conversation as always. Go to Twitter and Facebook. Tell me how this thing ends. We're going to talk endgame strategy when we come back. We're going to tell you why, if you don't already and think this is typical DC BS, should know this is a lot different, everybody. We'll tell you why the debt limit matters and why you ought to be concerned. Stay with us.